wasn't actually going to come to university. I originally wanted to be a jockey. And then one year I decided I was going to do my own charity event because I was bored in the summer. Decided, I'm actually quite good at this. And then 4 years later I'm still here.
I thought it would heighten my chances of getting a job, and there was the opportunity of a placement year, so I got experience as well as doing the degree at the same time.
The main reasons were to pretty much develop my network and develop my education skills. Especially into the industry that I wanted to go into.
Yeah. Trying to make a better life for ourselves and our children, really.
I felt age is never a barrier, and if others can do it, then why not go for it?
Well, at first I wasn't sure what I actually wanted to do, and I realised that probably university's going to open a lot more opportunities and doors to get into the industry that I kind of want to go into, but I wasn't sure.
For me, it was just I got told there's more opportunities in the future.
It kind of was a no-brainer really that I need these skills that they have given me.
For me it was more about the experience, meeting new people, getting to live away from home for a bit.
To be honest, I thought I wasn't going to enjoy it, and I did my first year and I'm staying now anyway, so I'm in my final year now, hopefully graduating, so yeah.
Okay, thanks. So as you would guess, this session is about the OFS duty that relates to equality of opportunity with regard not just to access, but also participation, so success and progression, getting on as well as getting in, as we've put it in the title. I'm delighted that it's not just me. I've got Claire Crawford from the University of Warwick and Ben Hunt, who's a member of our student panel from King's College London. I'm going to talk about what the OFS is going to do and why I think this is important, and I'm really pleased this has been a theme throughout the day. Claire is going to talk about the evidence. She's obviously expert on the student life cycle, and Ben is going to tell us what it's like from the front line. I do have a question facility here, so if you've managed to retrieve your password and you would like to write a question during the course of the next half an hour, they are going to be filtered, but I will pick out one or two if we've got some time towards the end. So let me start with a statement, and I think few in this room would disagree with this. Everyone should have the opportunity to build a good life for themselves and to unlock their potential, regardless of their background and their identity. That's important for individuals, but also, as we've heard during the course of the day, it's important for a cohesive and just society, and as jobs change into the future, for a productive economy. I think all of you here, given that you're here, would agree that higher education is absolutely central to this. It provides knowledge, credentials, networks and skills that are crucial for successful careers, but it's also nourishment for personal growth. It's both a gateway to a fulfilling life and fulfilling in itself. Many students will want a mobile experience. They'll want to travel away from home to university, have a residential experience, and indeed be interested in mobile lives and careers. But it's just as transformational for universities to be improving the lives of people who study at home, who want to work in the community where they grow up, and indeed, importantly, develop their skills later in life. One of the things we're obviously going to talk about now is that just as higher education can do all of this, it can also reflect and entrench disadvantage. For example, if you have the ability and desire to use the phrase in the regulatory framework, but you can't access the right course for you at the right time for you, if you're unable to continue with your studies or to perform to your full ability once you're in higher education, and indeed if you're unable to capitalise on the skills and the attributes, the time you've invested, the money you've invested when you're in higher education in your later life and career. Those are all key concerns for us, and unfortunately it is the case for too many that is the experience. And of course it's linked to socioeconomic factors. It's also linked crucially to their intersection with many characteristics that are protected in law, like ethnicity, gender and disability. So my conclusion at this point is, whilst we've improved opportunity by widening access to higher education, we are a long way from the equality of opportunity, which is the duty in the Act. And that's not just about access, It's about success and progression, all stages of the life cycle. I'm now going to hand over to Claire, who will flesh out some of the evidence on this.
Thanks very much, Chris, and thanks for the invitation to be here. So my research focuses on the determinants of differences in educational attainment and participation, according to a variety of characteristics, including socioeconomic status, with a view to try and better understanding what types of policies we might be able to use to try and reduce these gaps. So as Chris said, it's certainly the case that some progress has been made to try and reduce socioeconomic gaps in access to higher education over the last few years. But I think we'd probably all agree that there is still a reasonably long way to go. We still have very large differences in the chances of going to university between young people from different backgrounds. There's also still some way to go in terms of other outcomes that we might be interested in. For example, there's some evidence that gaps in terms of continuation rates and in progression beyond university between those from different backgrounds have actually widened over the last few years. So what I want to speak about briefly is what we think we can try and do to reduce these gaps further, and in particular to think about how the Office for Students might be able to support and incentivise activities that would help to support those aims. So my research highlights, as I'm sure many of you will be aware, not about my research but in general, the crucial role played by prior attainment earlier in the school system in explaining socioeconomic differences in who goes to university. So my research suggests that once we account for a very rich set of attainment measures at the end of secondary school, so once we look at people who have the same grades in the same subjects, in the same qualifications when they're age 16, we can actually shrink the gaps in terms of the likelihood of going to university essentially down to nothing. That suggests that, those measures of prior attainment are a really crucial, important determinant in who goes to university. Does that mean that universities can essentially wash their hands of the issue? Absolutely not. We should all be thinking about using our widening participation budgets to try and work with schools and other partners, as was discussed this morning, in a sustained way to try and help increase the attainment of those from disadvantaged backgrounds. And in particular, we would want to try and do that as early in the school system as we could. The focus really should be about trying to intervene before that crucial age 16 cut-off. The interventions that are focused exclusively on the post-secondary period are perhaps missing a trick in terms of really helping us to reduce the socioeconomic gaps as far as we can. But of course, this is going to be a long-term ambition. If we knew how to raise the attainment systematically of all students from all backgrounds, we would presumably be already doing it. So one question, of course, is what we want to be doing in the meantime, alongside these long-term sustained interventions that we hope might raise attainment. My view, supported by evidence that I've produced, but also other evidence in the literature, is that universities should be making greater use of contextual data than they are at the moment to help inform their admissions processes. With the right support, it's clear that students who are admitted to university with grades below the standard entry offers are able to succeed. And in particular, those from low-performing schools may even go on to outperform their peers from the more advantaged backgrounds. But that phrase I used, the right support, is really important. We've clearly made progress, as has been discussed, in terms of widening access to university, but as I mentioned earlier, the picture may not look quite so rosy in terms of success once there and indeed beyond into the labour market. We know some things about how to support students to succeed in university: a sense of belonging, embedding pastoral and academic care within the degree programmes widely, rather than necessarily focusing in just when students are in particular need. And yes, indeed, financial support can all help to reduce dropout and promote degree success. But actually, the evidence in both of these areas, both in terms of how we best widen access and how we best support students to succeed in university and beyond, is surprisingly weak in this country, perhaps especially given the fact that we've been able to invest significant resources in this area over the last few years. Evaluation has been an important priority for many over the last few years, but I think what I would suggest today is that we would really like to see it be at the heart of the investments we're making in this area going forward, because it's only by conducting credible, robust evaluations of what we're doing that we can really understand what works and indeed to try and improve our practice to help more students in the future. So there's clearly an important role for the Office for Students in being clear about what constitutes good evaluation and indeed incentivising institutions to embed that in everything they do. But we also want to guard against the risk that lots of institutions are conducting very similar interventions exclusively in isolation and evaluating those separately. We, I think, will learn the most, and indeed we will probably learn the most in a cost-effective way if we're able to evaluate larger scale programmes that are being conducted in a variety of institutions and across a variety of contexts, and indeed by ensuring that areas without a higher education institution in their vicinity are also able to benefit from outreach efforts. And again, I think there's a clear potential role for the Office for Students in incentivising, supporting and even funding such work. I'm going to finish by saying that, of course, we can't think about this agenda in isolation from what's going on elsewhere in the sector. So we'll need to ensure that the goals that we're discussing in this section are at the forefront of decisions that are being made in other fundamental areas over the coming months and years in terms of funding, teaching and research. Thanks.
Well done. Good afternoon, thank you for having me here. All of us in this room can agree that access to education is fundamental for the flourishing of the next generation. Education is not just an economic good, but a social one as well. It has the power to create creativity, giving people broader perspectives and critical thought that benefits students both instrumentally in the employability skills they gain and intrinsically in their confidence and ability to exchange ideas. Ultimately, society gains from this ethos. It is one of the most broadening experiences anyone can have. It tests resilience and patience, resolve, and the character of those who undergo it. Too often, as in my case, it can also test your health. I've spoken before to the Money and Mental Health Policy Institute about the intersection between personal finances at university and mental health. Much of what I will say about my own experience as a student is framed by this intersection. I was born in the northeast of England in a town called Thirsk and state educated. My father was a builder, my mother is a teacher who was a mature student at Leeds Trinity. She never pushed me in the direction of university, but I knew from about age 16 on entry into a state sixth form college in Darlington that I wanted to go to university. The information, advice and guidance that I received during my 2 years of A-levels was not comprehensive. There were few visits to universities from my college due to a lack of institutional links in the area and no promotion of alternative courses post A-levels that we could pursue apart from a degree. When applying through UCAS, the main frame of reference was the league tables, which didn't contain explicit metrics or information on institutional widening participation schemes in different universities. In regard to the whole student life cycle, we need to focus on interventions earlier in the application process, as many of an applicant's choices, as has been highlighted, are decided by earlier course choices, or even before making those choices in general. The options that students have, further, are often still determined geographically and economically. Darlington, where I applied from, has a university participation rate across the town of around 18%. There is a feeling there amongst many people that education isn't for them because of either its affordability in travelling to a different place or being able to afford to live, or the fear of being alone and alienated. It is our role to be receptive, reflective, and to react to student issues as we work to place them in the heart of the new regulator. and this involves the student cost of living. The OFS has the role of providing students with proper choice between institutions and strengthening information, advice and guidance to reflect this. This depends upon access to transparent data on different support mechanisms offered by institutions. It may also involve promotion of further interventions regarding student engagement in partnerships between FE institutions and HE providers, as there is currently a lack of this type of collaboration across the sector. This may help bridge the gap between impressions and choices made before application and the tangible experience of participation at university. When I came to university, I was isolated, not living near a campus because the accommodation I was in was one of the cheapest. Whilst access to higher education has risen over several years, the cost of living has gone up countrywide, especially in the south and London, and accommodation remains a hot topic for students. Many students feel dissatisfied with their experience in institutional accommodation, which here, for example, is often very much more expensive than the rented private sector. One of the most important growth and development opportunities for students at university is to be part of their community, especially for international students and widening participation students. I never got the experience to properly integrate until I was in my second year and part of a student society. I had to work all through my time until I was elected to my union, partially because I couldn't afford to live in London without working. Whilst this has given me invaluable skills, we need to begin to shift the conversation away from access to university and discuss accessibility within it. For example, as SU president, it concerned me how many students are working for over 20 hours a week just to stay in London. It is difficult to know what the solution should be to this without proper data, but this is clear. Many students still struggle with the cost of living. I accessed university counselling at the beginning of my second sabbatical year when I was elected president and completed a course of CBT over several weeks. Money was a large concern of mine, as I had considered that if I didn't win that election, I would have struggled to stay at university at all. The processes for accessing institutional support are often unclear. Counselling did help me work through a lot of things. My health often stemmed from a feeling of alienation and from a feeling of constantly needing to prove myself and my worth at such a renowned institution. And this is a thing shared by many widening participation students across the entire sector. To support this, research from the King's Behavioural Insights team found that widening participation students respond more actively when asked questions regarding community issues, whereas non-widening participation students respond more proactively to messages concerning employability. The insights I have raised over both the need for more accurate information, advice and guidance on the expectations students should have of university life and the next steps we need to take in assessing student access to opportunities at different stages of their life cycles are ambitions shared by the student panel and the OFS broadly. I am in this role and carried on after 2 wonderful but often challenging years as a student representative because I believe that the steps taken on widening participation have transformed many lives, mine included. But we should not stop until participation rates increase still. We should work so that students know the support they can receive, increase the quality of this, and enable students to access opportunities at every stage of their learning. Education at all points of life should be a genuine possibility for everyone. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks Ben and Claire, inspiring stuff. So let me conclude with what the OFS is going to do. So success in this area will depend for me on issues like how universities and colleges work with schools, communities and employers, how students are supported at each stage of the life cycle, and crucially also how we deploy the resources, the evidence and all the expertise that we have available to us, particularly across universities and colleges. But ultimately it'll be judged by whether we get the transformational change that people are calling for this morning, whether we get the significant reduction we think we need in the gaps in access, success and progression. So the regulatory framework, as the previous session made clear, puts this absolutely front and centre for the work of the OFS. It's there in the first objective, which runs not just through the plans, but through all of our work. Students from all backgrounds with the ability and the desire should be supported to access success and progress from higher education. And obviously, we're particularly interested in those from disadvantaged backgrounds, those with the qualities characteristics where there are the greatest risks. It's the first condition of registration to have an access and participation plan if you're charging above the basic undergraduate fee. And we provide guidance on all of that today on how you can go about that using the timescales that Susan was talking about earlier. We see our role as being about pressure, but also support. So we apply pressure through the assessment of the plans. And as we mentioned earlier, in this area, unlike in others, we're not just regulating to the baseline, we're looking for continuous improvement. And we define that in the guidance in a number of different ways. So firstly, we'll be looking for all providers that are coming in with an access and participation plan to have a plan to reduce significantly over time the gaps in access, success and progression. And obviously that will, the priorities there will vary between different providers according to your analysis of your own data and our analysis of the data and how we challenge you on that. But that's not the only element of continuous improvement. Reflecting particularly on some of the things that Claire was saying, continuous improvement for us means also improving your practice. So better use of evidence, better evaluation to understand and deploy what we know works, to use the investment effectively, but also more sustained and in-depth collaboration. Clearly schools are key here, and there's a strong interest in government and universities collaborating with schools, but also if you take the progression pillar with employers, and it's not just about equipping students with the skills and attributes they need to thrive in the job market. Universities also have really mature relationships and colleges have mature relationships with employers that can help bring access for mature students and also help employers understand how they can capitalise on the talents and the skills of graduates. So we see that continuous improvement element being about collaboration not just with schools but also with employers. We also, thinking about the structure of the regulatory framework, see a stronger role for support here than perhaps any other area. We will have a strong championing role, exposing the big problems. So we've talked today about white working class boys, for example, black attainment gap, mature students. All of those will be key issues where we'll be trying to identify the problems and surface what we could do to address them. Also a key area here is how we develop and share evidence and innovative practice. And we have been asked by the government to develop an evidence and impact exchange which will provide that kind of underpinning commissioning, corralling and dissemination of the evidence and what works in this area. There are also, it's important to say that by bringing the access regulation into the OFS, we get to use all the wider levers of the OFS. So, for example, all the work that we will do, picking up on what Claudia was talking about this morning on student decision making, will need to take account of the particular challenges, for example, for first in family students around making decisions and their information needs. As we develop our quality assessment, we will look systematically at the outcomes for students from different backgrounds. And of course, that's a core element also of the TEF. In promoting choice, we'll be interested in how we can get a more diversified offer, how we can get a more flexible offer, for example, to respond to the needs of mature students. So across all of our work, not just the access and participation plans, we'll be thinking about how we can drive that first objective. We have a great platform through the Act and also through the regulatory framework to be bold and to be innovative in this area. And so we'll be talking to you during 2018 about how we can take that forward. Unlocking the imagination and the ambition of the next generation of students is absolutely key to this. So we really owe it to them to succeed. Thank you. So I think we've got a bit of time now for questions. I'm going to filter these a little, and I may not be able to answer all of the questions that you gave us, but I'll share them to a degree with Claire and Ben as well. So perhaps, Claire, picking up one of the issues you raised, how do you think we can make progress on contextual admissions?
How can we make progress? More institutions should do it. From an Office for Students perspective, what can
I think there's a question about what's the role of the Office for Students? How could we support providers to make progress on contextual admissions as well?
So you could certainly think about it being part of the a component of the access agreement plans that you ask institutions to complete. Perhaps thinking of it as an opt-out exercise with justification rather than an opt-in. I think we clearly do need some more evidence in this area from institutions who are doing it to learn more about how they're supporting the students once they've admitted them with lower grades. And I guess I should emphasise it's not just about admitting students with lower grades, but a whole range of other ways in which contextual data could be used in the admissions process, from thinking about students being more likely to be given greater consideration in the admissions process, or more likely to be interviewed if that's relevant, and so on and so forth. But I think, yeah, I mean, I definitely would like to see it being made more use of, and I guess, as I said, in the access agreements, and potentially thinking of it as an opt-out rather than an opt-in approach to widening access.
Okay. Ben, can I ask you a question? So one of the questions here is about the part-time and mature student market, which has been it's long been a concern from the perspective of continuation, but also, of course, reducing numbers. I wonder if you've got any reflections from your role working with students in KCL about what are the particular barriers for mature students, and again, how we could address that.
Yeah, I think there are a few barriers for mature students. I think one of them in particular is what you touched on around isolation in the community, and especially where institutions are spread over multiple campuses, or else mature students are living at home, or else have other professions. Actually feeling a sense of community and belonging to an institution can be quite a challenge. So some of the things that we did in my time in the Students' Union was to put on particular events in the welcome period to an institution, where we would bring travelling students together, we'd bring stay-at-home students together and mature learners as well, to try and give them a sense and a network at the institution, and especially in a place like King's, which is spread across 5 different discrete campuses. People often travel between those campuses and will commute from quite far away and then go home again. It can be quite difficult, especially for mature learners who may be accessing services and learning differently, to actually feel part of that. So I would certainly encourage institutions to reflect on some best practice around interventions towards discrete groups, and with more contextual information to back that, and those interventions, I think they would be more effective than perhaps they currently are. It seems part of the time that students are lumped together in a lot of this stuff, whereas actually a student's perception of an institution varies wildly across which stage of life they're in and their experience.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so I'm going to pick out a couple of questions which are clearly for me. So the first one is, what is going to happen to the National Collaborative Outreach Programme and its funding? So all of the funding arrangements that came through HEFCE will transfer into the Office for Students. Obviously, what we want to do in the Office for Students is understand what role collaborative outreach funding like that would play as part of the broader landscape within which we're also regulating. So we'll be discussing that in March when we look at all of the Office for Students funding, and that is in tune with a 2-year break point for what was originally a 4-year cycle. I think my own view is that there's very clear basis in the Act to support collaboration where it's in the interests of students and indeed employers, and that collaborative outreach piece which supports efficiency, so it ensures there's not duplication, it's targeted where we can see particular gaps, it ensures there's not duplication for schools. I think there's a strong argument for that, but we need to work out how that fits with what we expect from universities through our regulation. The other key piece is how it links in with all the things that Claudia was talking about this morning in terms of a range of routes that students may take at different points in their life. So further questions. So there's a question about what will an outcomes-focused approach mean for access and participation regulation. I think it is fair to say that the way in which access agreements have been regulated over time, there's been a strong focus on the plan, so the content of the plan, and also the spending. And I think that remains important, but we will as a new regulator, be more focused on the outcomes, so looking systematically at what the data tells us about how different providers are performing on access, on success, and on progression. And as was mentioned in the earlier session, we'll be looking systematically at the risk of each provider in relation to different conditions. And so that analysis, that outcomes-based analysis, will inform our judgment of risk, and that in turn will inform how we engage with different providers over time. So we see ourselves developing a more outcomes-based approach through which the nature of the engagement and the expectations are quite strongly driven by how different providers are performing in relation to different stages of the life cycle. Okay, other questions. So there's a question here about what will happen to targets. So Offer has had an established approach to targets where institutions set their own targets, but there's considerable challenge from the director. We want, during the course of 2018, to review all of the targets, almost to do a baseline review, and look for a system that could be supportive of both doing activity that benefits everyone, but also linked strongly to all of those outcomes expectations as well. So we haven't reformed it a great deal in the guidance that you will see today, but we are wanting to work with you to review it all and make changes for the access and participation plans from 2021. Okay, well, there's a specific question here about refugees and asylum seekers. I wonder, Ben, have you got experience from King's College about supporting those groups?
So King's has introduced one of the most extensive, what's called a sanctuary scholarships programs in the country, which particularly deals with refugee and asylum seeker students. It is part of the sort of general participation offer that the institution has, but of course comes under different criteria for people to access that. King's has done outreach in different countries like Jordan and Syria and places affected by the refugee crisis as well, and has done some online education in those areas in a programme called Panellists. And so it is supporting students both in the region and in them coming to London. When students from those backgrounds come here, it can be quite challenging. Often the mental health support that they need is quite specified, and often it's beyond the capacity of the institution to give it to them because of the trauma that they have faced in fleeing the areas that they've had and in coming here, or indeed experiencing university in the region that they're in for their education. But I think it's a real success story and a testament to many institutions in the sector that they have expanded the refugee and sanctuary scholarships offer. I think it's really positive, and I think especially where we are globally in political terms, it's very reassuring that the sector does that for students, and it shows the ambition that everyone should be able to access education and that we should remain an international system.
Okay. Right, that's it from me. The clock has counted down. Thanks you for your questions. I'm now going to hand back to Michael, who will introduce the next session. Could we just say thank you again to Ben and to Claire?
It's almost tea time, so I've just got to say I want to comment on what we've just heard from these three very briefly. It's really important. Congratulations on the session, all three of you. It was really, really good. As you've seen from what Chris said, and as you'll see in the regulatory framework, this is very much the top priority. We're really committed to making a difference here. As Claire said, we want to be driven and informed by the evidence. That doesn't mean we wouldn't want to innovate. We may well want to see innovation as well, but we're taking the evidence into account always. We want to have very high standards, as Chris was saying about in the question on targets. Could we do more? We want to be bold. Ben made a very important point about Darlington and the aspirations in a place such as Darlington. And it shows how important it is for us as a higher education sector and the Office for Students as a regulator to work actively with other sectors, including obviously the school sector, the college sector, and employers. And somewhere in that mix, I feel sure there are bold innovations that we could make at institutional level and maybe at systemic level that would make a big difference. When I think about it from my personal point of view, having spent 30 years engaged in school reform in this country and elsewhere, I just feel that if somehow in this new role I should be able to contribute without in any way interfering in Chris's work, I hasten to add, somehow knitting together the elements of the education system that could provide young people between the ages of 14 and 24, say, not forgetting mature students and people returning to university, where we could make a significant difference. I think the whole sector, every time I go to a university, I never meet anybody who isn't really committed to doing this. But we're, and I also rarely, if ever, meet anybody who isn't frustrated that we haven't got more progress, in spite of the fact that as a result of offer, we really have made what internationally, by the way, is seen as quite dramatic progress. But everybody wants to do more. So we want this to be a sector-wide and institutional level, the sector working with other sectors, getting beyond it's the school's fault or the school saying it's the university's fault, into something that knits together a pathway or a whole series of pathways that enable that unlocking of potential that Chris started talking about, and I know he's passionate about, and we will, as a board and an organisation, give a huge commitment to.